What can we learn from reflecting on the life of ordinary Romans during the time of Marcus Aurelius? What was life like for the ordinary Roman? What was life on the ancient farm like? What was life in Rome like? How many people lived in ancient Rome? How much of the population were slaves? And what was life as a slave like? And what were the social classes in Rome? How and why did slavery transition to serfdom in the later Roman Empire? And what were the Roman roads, aqueducts, travel, and banking like? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. The overwhelming majority of ancient people lived on farms in the country. Often these farmers retreated behind the city walls when an army marched to the countryside. The best example is how the Athenian farmers crowded behind the walls of Athens when the Spartans raided Attica. This led to overcrowding, which often meant that the plague could strike the population during a siege, such as in Athens in the beginnings of the Peloponnesian Wars. Quite often there were no nearby cities where they could seek refuge. For example, Sparta had no city walls, and Plutarch in his sayings of Spartan women reveals that often Spartan women were seized and forced to be concubines when their city-states were conquered. Professor Aldrete, in his Wondrium lecture on the history of the ancient world, points out that the ancient historians and sources are silent on what life was like for the many farmers who labored in obscurity, that these ancient histories are really histories of political leaders and city dwellers. But for every person who lived in the city, in much of the ancient world, 8 or 9 lived on a family farm. Now the ratio differed around Rome. About a quarter of the people in that vicinity lived in the city. Most people never traveled more than 20 miles from home, never saw a king, never read a book, or heard a philosopher speak. Most people living on farms didn't even know the name of the Roman emperor, and life went on as before, no matter who was emperor. Now the infant mortality rate in the ancient world was incredibly high. Between a quarter and a third of infants died in the first year of life. If you survived to adolescence, you had a decent chance of surviving until middle age, although most people died before they were 50. The diet of many ordinary people in the ancient world was just above a starvation diet. So many women died in childbirth that Roman wives often updated their wills when they learned they were pregnant. Even for wealthy families, infant mortality was high. For example, Marcus Aurelius married Faustina, the daughter of his predecessor, Emperor Antoninus Pius, when he was 24 and she was 14, which was somewhat typical for the ancient world. She bore him 15 children, of whom only 6 survived to adulthood. In the end, only one son survived to be in the line of succession, the murderous Commodus. Marcus Aurelius includes in his meditations some fatalistic thoughts on how the ancient parents can cope with this high mortality rate. Pray not for some way to save your child, but for a way to lose your fear of this. Your children are like leaves. The wind scatters some of them on the ground. Such are the children of men. As you kiss your son good night, whisper to yourself that he may be dead in the morning. So what was ordinary life like for Roman citizens? Now in the ancient world, over half of the household budget for the lower classes was spent on food. To keep the citizenry of Rome contented and keep them from rebelling, the state guaranteed a dole of wheat for all male citizens, enough to feed an individual, but not enough to feed his entire family. The state owned the grain plantations in northern Africa, which were really slave plantations, consuming about 15% of the state budget. Far more wheat was sold on the open market in Rome, about 85% of the wheat raised in Africa. The Roman state also provided cheap wine for the masses and erected public baths open to all classes of society, in addition to free entertainment in the arena, such as the famous gladiator contests. There were both large and small farms in Italy, mostly raising vines, olives, and cereals, which is known as the Mediterranean Triad, although some also grew dry legumes such as broad beans, peas, chickpeas, and lentils. Many farms raised livestock such as goats, cows, sheep, and pigs, particularly if they were near a town. Italy was arid, raining only sporadically in the summer months, which meant that North Africa was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, raising most of its grains. What was farming like in ancient Rome? The historian Wilder says that the modes and tools of tillage were essentially as they had been for centuries. Plow, spade, hoe, pick, pitchfork, scythe, rake had scarcely changed in 3,000 years. Corn was ground in mills, turned by water or by beasts. Screw pumps and water wheels raised water out of the mines or into irrigation canals. Soils were protected by crop rotation and fertilized by manure, alfalfa, clover, rye, or beans. Olive orchards and grapevines were numerous, and fruit and nut trees of every sort from all over the empire were grown. And he continues, a large part of Italy was given over to grazing. The cheapest soils and slaves could be used for the raising of cattle, sheep, and swine. Careful attention was paid to scientific breeding. Horses were bred chiefly for war, hunting, and sport, seldom as draft animals, whereas oxen drew the plow and the cart, and mules bore burdens on their backs. Cows, sheep, and goats gave 3 kinds of milk, from which the Italians made delectable cheeses. They were small manufacturers. About 1 in 20 were involved in the textile trade, plus there were small brick, marble, pottery, and glass works. And what was the free and enslaved population of the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire was at its zenith when Trajan was emperor. It was about half the size of the United States, stretching from Iberian Spain to Parthian Persia, and from Egypt to England. During the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, about 20% of the world's population lived in the Roman Empire, about 80 million people, roughly the size of the Han Empire in distant China. The city of Rome grew in size during the Roman Empire. Under Julius Caesar, Rome's population was about 750,000. Under Trajan, about 1 million. And under Emperor Antoninus Pius, predecessor of Marcus Aurelius, about 1,250,000. Now, the slave population of the empire was between 7 and 10 million at the time of Marcus Aurelius, and about 500,000, or about 40% of the population of Rome, were slaves. Many had been enslaved in the conquests. We had previously discussed the types of slaves in the ancient world. Now we will discuss the types of slaves in Roman society around the time of Marcus Aurelius. Were household slaves and slaves on small country farms sometimes treated as part of the family as they were in ancient Greece? Perhaps we know that they included Greek slaves who served as tutors for the aristocrats. Epitaphs on tombstones reveal that there could be affectionate relations between masters and slaves. Will Durant provides examples. One owner said a dead servant was as dear to him as a son. A young noble mourns the death of his nurse, and a learned lady raises an elegant memorial to her librarian. And what were the general categories of slaves? Household servants and small farm slaves usually had it best. And then concubines were below them, often captured in war. We don't know if this was as preponderant in Rome as it was other societies, but we assume it was. And least numerous was independent city slaves who became tradesmen. A lot of times they could purchase their freedom. And the most numerous were the field hands in large plantations. And since the slave owner had minimal contact with these slaves, their lives could be quite harsh. And of course in Rome, a lot of these were POWs. And a death sentence were the slaves who worked in the mines. The wealthier Romans had more household slaves and positions. Sometimes they literally had hundreds of slaves, and as the historian McLean notes, a ludicrous division of labor arose. One slave would buy groceries, another would cook, another would put on his master's shoes, another would dress him, another massage him, and others followed him to attend to his every need. Roman slaves were often talented, clever, and educated, occupying positions of responsibility and with a real prospect of freedom. Some slaves in large households had de facto control of great wealth, supervised other workers, both free and slave, and sometimes were themselves served by other slaves. Yet despite their managerial powers and often sumptuous lifestyle, they owned nothing legally and were subject to the arbitrary whim of their masters. Other sources said that Roman slaves could own property, and if they were craftsmen, they were permitted to keep a small share of their revenues, and from that they could save up to eventually purchase their freedom. And the Roman slaves who had it worse were those who worked in the great plantations, or latifunди, and of course the miners. And many of the slaves who worked on these great estates were kept in chains at night. The Romans typically did not slay the military-age men in their conquests, as was done by many of the Greek city-states. They often sent them to work on these plantations. Now, mining was so dangerous in the ancient world that the slave who worked the mines was living under a virtual death sentence. What were other sources of slaves? Pirates historically sold their captives into slavery, but the early Roman emperors vigorously opposed the pirate ships, ridding the Mediterranean of the scourge of piracy. McLean notes that foundlings, or children abandoned in the marketplaces by those too poor to properly raise them, were a major source of Roman slaves. This custom wasn't abandoned until about 374 AD during the reign of the Christian emperors. Plus, many slaves were born into slavery. Manumission or freeing of slaves was common in the Roman Empire. One Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, who inspired Marcus Aurelius, was himself a former slave of a former slave. Some former slaves or freedmen became quite wealthy in the early years of the Roman Empire. But the Roman class distinctions never forgot that you were a former slave or freedman. As a freedman, you still had residual obligations to your former master, as your former master was now your patron, and as a freedman, you were often part of his entourage. The Old Testament prophets and the Jewish rabbis, the Stoic philosophers, including Seneca, and the Christian apostles and church fathers over the century gradually improved the lot of slaves and those in the lower classes. They urge us to ensure that we treat the poor and immigrants with fairness, ensuring that they can live their lives with security and dignity. And what were the social classes in Rome at the time of Marcus Aurelius? Roman society was a traditional society where wealth was tied up in farms and land. And like the Greeks, the Roman aristocrats lived the lives of country gentlemen, disdaining having to work for a living, especially avoiding working as merchants. The senatorial class was drawn from the Roman aristocracy. Those Romans who were modestly wealthy were eligible to enter the equestrian class, who were also eligible to attend the senatorial sessions. Below them came the wealthy landowners who were eligible to serve as jurymen. Below them were the professional classes, which include the freedmen, the shop owners, retail traders, money changers, artisans, doctors, and teachers, and other professions and minor municipal officials. At the bottom were wage earners earning very little. Many of them may have lived lives more miserable than many slaves. Now, there was a dramatic chasm between the wealthy aristocrats and the lower classes of laborers. The income of the landed aristocracy doubled or trebled in the first century under the rule of the early emperors and increased about 4 times from 100 AD to 400 AD. Roman aristocrats were expected to live large, flouting their wealth. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, the fortunes of the modestly wealthy averaged about 20 million sesterces, while the average wages were just 4 sesterces a day. The gap between rich and poor was much greater than even this gap in Victorian England. Taxation was not heavy. There were no property taxes in Italy until the end of the 3rd century. Death duties were levied at 5% until the 3rd century, and tribute was collected in the provinces at 5 or 10%. And what was the transition from slavery to serfdom? Professor Kenneth Harl of Wondrium and the Teaching Company notes that sometime between the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the Middle Ages that the primary labor system transitioned from slavery to serfdom, in a process that is poorly documented for many regions of the Roman Empire. The process is somewhat better documented for Rome and Italy. After Hadrian and his successors consolidated the empire, this meant that the Roman army would enslave far fewer conquered, though Marcus Aurelius did enslave many particularly hostile German tribesmen. Now Marcus Aurelius had another more practical solution. He inducted defeated Germanic tribesmen into the Roman legions, serving in other theaters of war. And some of these soldiers served Rome very well. There was not a serious drop in the number of slaves in Rome until the reign of Marcus Aurelius, which was due to the severe manpower shortage caused by an outbreak of the plague. One consequence of the abandonment of wars of conquest meant that there were far fewer foreign captives who were forced into slavery. Some owners of large estates responded by breaking some of them up into small holdings that they leased to free tenants who paid in rent and labor, and this included many government estates. And what were the Roman roads and aqueducts like, and what was it like to travel and bank in the Roman Empire? Will Durant has many interesting observations about Roman technology. The Romans are famous for their roads. Their durability was because they're built like layers like today's roads, with a base layer of sand, overlaid with 4 strata of masonry, including stones and concretes, and topped by closely fitting stone slabs, with local variations in construction. But properly engineered modern roads are far superior. Roman roads lasted far longer because ancient vehicles were much lighter and much slower than modern vehicles. And Roman bridges were often built on piles driven into the riverbed. The Roman road system was extensive. Italy alone had 12,000 miles of paved roads. There were over 50,000 miles of roads throughout the empire. Ships were numerous, powered by both sails and oars. Some ships had 3 decks. Some cargo ships could hold 1,000 tons of freights. And some passenger ships could carry 600 passengers. But sailing was safest closest to shore. Shipwrecks were common. We know St. Paul was shipwrecked in Acts, and sailing between November and March was especially hazardous. but piracy was eliminated early in the history of the Roman Empire. Pliny thought that the Roman aqueducts were Rome's greatest achievement. They carried water to homes and public buildings and gardens, with enough left over to fill artificial lakes to host staged water battles in the Colosseum. But they needed constant maintenance. They used lead pipes and were out of service by the end of the Western Empire. As trade was extensive, so was the banking system. As Will Durant tells us, the bankers were everywhere. They served as money changers, accepted checking and savings accounts, issued travelers' checks and bills of exchange, bought and sold real estate, placed investment in collected debts, and lent money to individuals and partnerships. Now, interest rates varied from 4% under Augustus to 12% under Constantine. There were financial panics as today. But Dr. Wikipedia posits that Roman bankers disappeared from the historical record sometime after 260 AD, possibly due to currency debasement. Also in succeeding videos, we'll look at the Roman emperors through the time of Marcus Aurelius. And we decided to look further into the biography of Marcus Aurelius after our fascinating videos some time ago on whether or not Marcus Aurelius was a persecutor or friend of Christians, and on his meditations, which paradoxically have troublesome references to Christians, as well as extolling virtues which Christians find admirable. We're also going to look at the biography of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and of the Emperor Commodus. We're also going to review a history of the Christian persecutions under these early Roman emperors. Now to discuss the sources we used for this video. The modern historian Frank Lynn's biography of Marcus Aurelius is over 500 pages. About half the pages are background information, including what life was like for ordinary Romans in the time of Marcus Aurelius. We already cut another video on what ordinary life was like for people living in the ancient world, particularly Greece and Rome. But he had a lot of new material, so we added to this video. Although it is dated, written in 1944, Will Durant's history, Caesar and Christ, has a chapter on what life was like for ordinary Romans. Plus, Will Durant is always very quotable. He's an excellent writer. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.